We are continuing with topic 2, partial elasticity in particular, for part 3 of your week 5 slides. So in terms of the prescribed readings for this section, it is chapters 2.5 and 8.5, 8.5 in particular of your prescribed textbook. And for knowledge enrichment purposes, you can consult the Jacques textbook, and that is chapter 5.2.1 for partial elasticity. Now, from your first year, you only dealt with one unknown variable, and that was the price of the good. So, in first year economics, you learned that the quantity demanded of a good could only be influenced by that selling price of the good, right? So, this was an expression for your demand, for your quantity demanded. And year B, that coefficient of Q over there is the slope of your demand curve. Graphically, when you would illustrate your demand curve, you would have price on the vertical axis and quantity demanded on the horizontal axis. And you know that your slope of a linear function is your change in y over your change in x. So hence here your change in y is the change in price over your change in x, your horizontal axis, and that is the change in q. So that b is the slope of this function. Now, based on this above, you saw that your price elasticity of demand was calculated as follows. So this is your price elasticity of demand, that coefficient, and the formula was given to you in first year as your change in Q over your change in P times P over Q. And this was at a point, so point price elasticity of demand. Now, do you see that your change in Q over your change in P, this portion of the formula, is in fact the inverse of the slope? So the slope B was changing Q over changing P. So you can see that this is in fact the inverse of the slope. Therefore, another way of writing your elasticity of demand for your first year could have been P over Q times 1 over B, B representing that your slope, because another way of writing this portion could also be your changing Q over your changing P. This negative 1 is only placed in the formula so that it makes our analysis a bit easier, because we know that there is an inverse relationship between your quantity demanded and price, so it will always yield a negative coefficient. But when we interpret that coefficient, we interpret it in absolute terms. So by inserting that -1 in the formula, we end up with your coefficient in absolute terms, and you can of course interpret if it's elastic, inelastic, etc. Now, the previous assumption that was made regarding only one unknown, namely the price of the variable itself, that was a somewhat unreasonable assumption to make, because we know that other factors also affect the quantity demanded. And that is other factors such as income, the price of related goods, for instance, such as the price of complements and substitutes. So if we have a look at the quantity demanded here, given by a Q1, we now can state it as it is a function of P1, and P1 is going to pertain to the price of the good. P2 is going to pertain to the price of related goods, such as complements and substitutes, and Y is going to stand for income. So now your quantity demanded depends on other factors other than just the price of the good. From this function now, the following elasticities can be calculated, right? So remember P1 represented the price of the good itself. So therefore we have our price elasticity of demand, and that is equal to the price of the good over the quantity of the good times the first order partial derivative of this function, but with respect to the price of the good. And remember, we insert the negative just so that we are able to interpret the absolute value. Then we have our cross elasticity of demand, EP2 or EC, the subscript C, and this tells us that we are going to look at, in particular, the price of related goods, because the quantity demanded now depends on the prices of related goods such as your complements and substitutes. So hence this is our cross elasticity of demand, and the formula there is now the price of the related good P2 over the quantity of the good times the first order partial derivative of the function with respect to the price of other goods. And then lastly, we have our income elasticity of demand. So EY, that's subscript Y, pertains to income. And here the formula is going to be Y over the quantity demanded of the good times the first order partial derivative of this function, but with respect to income Y. So we have a function now of three independent variables, not just one. So you can see why partial derivatives came into play for us to obtain our partial elasticities because of those three independent variables in this function, not just the one. So in terms of these elasticity coefficients, your price elasticity, your cross elasticity, and income elasticity, you will still interpret it in the same way as you did before. So this is just a summary of the interpretation of your partial elasticities. Now, you should be familiar from this from first year, right? So with your price elasticity of demand, if it was equal to zero, it was perfectly inelastic. And if it was equal to infinity, it was perfectly elastic. We know that if it is greater than one but less than infinity, it was elastic, and if it was greater than zero but less than one, it was inelastic, and then lastly, if it was equal to one, it was unitary. With your cross price elasticity, we could determine if the goods were either related or unrelated. So if your elasticity coefficient, your cross price elasticity coefficient is equal to zero, then the two goods are unrelated, such as milk or cars. But if it is positive, then it tells us that it is substitutes. So it could be an example such as butter and margarine. Or if your cross price elasticity coefficient was negative, then you had a situation where the goods were related and they were complements, such as the jam and bread or cars and tires. And then lastly, your income elasticity coefficient. If it was greater than zero but less than one, so positive but smaller than one, you had a normal essential good, right? Such as milk, bread, etc. If that elasticity coefficient, that income elasticity was greater than one, so positive and greater than one, it is a normal luxury good. And then lastly, if it was less than zero, it was referred to as an inferior good. So if that income elasticity was negative, you had an inferior good. So you're going to interpret these in the same way. So here we have an example. You have your function Q is equal to 60 minus 3 P1. So P1 is the price of Q1, the good. You have P2, which is going to be the price of the related goods, plus 0.25Y, and that Y represents the income. And you are given the price of the good, the price of the related goods being 10, and your income is equal to 800. So it says calculate the price elasticity of demand, your cross elasticity, and your income elasticity for this particular function. So you have a function of three independent variables, and you need to calculate these three partial elasticities. So let's look at the first one over here, right? So here we have to calculate the own price elasticity of demand, and you're going to substitute the values for P1, P2, and Y into that function to determine what Q1 is going to be. So if you substitute P1 was 5, P2 was 10, and Y was 100, you can determine what Q1 is. And your price elasticity of demand formula, right, was minus P1 over Q1. So P1 was 5 and Q1 you just determined was 265, right? You just determined that. So you've got P1 over Q1 times the first order partial derivative of this function with respect to P1. So where do I have P1 in this function? Just over there. So if I get my first order partial derivative of Q1 with respect to P1, it is just going to be minus 3. So let's substitute that information in this formula. So therefore, my price elasticity of demand is going to be minus 5 over 265. Remember, we had the negative in the formula so that we can interpret the absolute value. Times minus 3, that was your first order partial derivative, and you get an answer of 0.057. So therefore, it's positive but less than 1. So therefore, it is inelastic. Next, we have our cross price elasticity. So EP2 or EC to represent the cross price elasticity. And remember, Q1 was now a function of 3 independent variables. So therefore, we need to obtain the first order partial derivative. So now in this case, we're going to get the first order partial derivative of this function with respect to P2, treating P1 and Y as constant. So therefore, remember the formula was given for EC for your cross price elasticity as the price of the related good over the quantity of the other good times the first order partial derivative of our function with respect to the price of the related goods. So we know that P2 was 10. And we know from previously that Q1, when you substituted 5, 10, and y equal to 800 into Q1, we could determine that Q1 was equal to 265. So there I have my P2 and I have my Q1. The next part is saying multiplied by the first order partial derivative of this function with respect to P2, treating P1 and y as constant. So therefore, the first order partial derivative, I treat that as a constant, and that I'm simply left with plus 2. So therefore, my cross price elasticity was 0.075 and it is positive. So therefore, it is a substitute. Lastly, we have our income elasticity, and you're going to follow the same reasoning here. Here we're going to get our formula for our income elasticity. We have Y, which was 800 over Q1, which we determined to be 265, times the first order partial derivative of the function, but now with respect to y, treating P1 and P2 as constant. So therefore, it's just plus 0.25. So therefore, I have my form, substitute those values into this formula. I'm going to have 800 over Q1 is 265 times my first order partial derivative with respect to y. It was just 0.25 and that gives me an answer of 0.755. So it's positive, so it's a normal good, but it's less than 1, so it is just an essential good. So that is how you will go about solving your 3 partial elasticities. Now, the next couple of slides are worked examples. So slide 28 and 29, the next two, also asks that you calculate your partial elasticities, your price elasticity of demand, your cross price elasticity, and your income elasticity. You also need to interpret your answers, and the answers are given as well as the interpretation. So please work through that example as well as the following question on slide 30 and 31. Here, you are asked to calculate your price elasticity, cross and income elasticity, but the calculations are not given, just the answers and the interpretation. So please work through those. And then another couple of homework exercises from an exercise book, question 29 and 30. Again, you're asked to first calculate Q1, then your price elasticity, then your cross elasticity, and then your income elasticity for both questions. And the answers are again given. So work through these examples as practice. And that concludes this week's work.